All right, so welcome everyone to our final event of the conference. This is a panel that will be hosted by RE17, and will cover the topic of re-envisioning sustainability for local communities. So we have three panelists here today. One is going to be joining us a little bit late. So here we have Bo and Charlotte. Annabelle will be joining hopefully in a few. But if you both could just start off by introducing yourselves with your name, pronouns, where you're calling in from today, and just a little bit about your background, that would be great.
Sure, I guess I can start. So my name is Bo Aganaba is how you say my last name. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, which is also known as Ottawa in some circles. And I was not born here, nor did I grow up here, but I am fortunate to call this place home now. And I do feel a sense of belonging to this part of the world now that I've been living here for a few years and gotten a chance to kind of ground myself here. And so one of the things I really enjoy about land acknowledgements in general is just having that sense of belonging to the land, and how that there are people who really do truly belong to this land and are really part of it in a way, and in the way that they tell their stories. And so we, for myself as an immigrant to this country, and also as to someone who now calls this place home, I feel like I have an opportunity and a privilege to be able to learn from the people who have traditionally called this place home as well. For a little bit more about my background, I'm previously was the executive director of a youth-led sustainability nonprofit called Leading Change Canada, which I did for a number of years, and that was sort of my larger context or entrance into the environmental space, specifically, especially in the youth-facing arena. But through that role, I had an opportunity to really interact with the climate movement more widely, as well as how different sectors are approaching these kind of the polycrisis, if you want to call it that. And it really gave me a sense of understanding that there's not one way to think about these issues or one way to approach them. And it also gave me the confidence to really kind of listen to myself and what really animates me in terms of how I want to participate in this broader movement. And that is why I ultimately decided to try and start my own thing, which is what I'm doing now. So I started an organization or a company called Good Being. And my purpose through this business, through this organization, is essentially to go on my own personal journey and be able to share what I'm learning through that personal journey with other people, whether it's individuals or teams. The point is that I think we have to start from this sort of individual perspective in order to be able to kind of transform some of these systems. And if we can think about them in a more holistic way, in a way that sort of captures our identity as human beings and our full identity as human beings as part of nature itself, then maybe we can actually start to generate some solutions that take into consideration maybe more of our identities as human beings and as manifestations of nature as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Bo, for that introduction. And now, Charlotte, feel free to introduce yourself.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Bo, for taking it away. I was going to pop into the chat to ask if you would go first, but you very kindly anticipated my doing that. Yeah, so I'll give a short introduction as well. My name is Charlotte Taylor, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently calling in from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I really appreciated Bo's note about land acknowledgements. I know that there is a lot of really important discourse around some of the different important elements of land acknowledgements, how they might be perceived, and also really importantly, how they are in different contexts backed up or not backed up by action on really important frameworks like decolonization, like land back movements. And I think that's always really critical to keep in mind. And I also just appreciate land acknowledgements as a really consistent reminder of the responsibility that we have to the people and the lands in which we're sharing. So I think that that's a really helpful framing to enter into this conversation, which I'm really excited to have about sustainability, but also systems change and how those two concepts kind of coexist. I'll give a little bit of background on myself as well. So I'm currently an undergraduate student at UBC at the University of British Columbia. And I also am the Critically Engaged Voices lead at the UBC Climate Hub, or the Climate Hub at UBC, as we're officially supposed to be called. And I've really enjoyed getting to work with a really, really incredible team there. A lot of the work that I do is centered around amplifying and highlighting the work of Indigenous and also critically engaged climate activists, which is just bringing a little bit more of a critical eye to issues and discussions such as false solutions, and just thinking a little bit more deeply about how we approach climate justice. So I'm really excited to get to participate in this conversation today. For other things about my work and what I'm involved in, I do also help to serve as the co-editor-in-chief of the UBC Journal for Climate Justice, which I can share with anyone who's interested. We're an up-and-coming new journal, but we're really excited this year to be publishing both a standard academic journal edition and also multimedia collection, which I think will be a really, really interesting kind of synthesis of different kinds of creative and academic climate works. And I'm excited to see what that ends up looking like. Yeah, I think that's everything about me. If Annabelle's not available yet, maybe Nicole, do you want to take it away?
Actually, I think when Annabelle joins in, we can have her introduce herself, because I feel like she'll do a better job than I will. But I think thanks for the introduction, Charlotte, and we already have some great conversation topics being brought up, so I can't wait to see what the rest of this panel is going to hold. And I think we can get into it right now. So to start us off and to get our imaginations going, the first question I have for both of you is, if you could reimagine your city to be sustainable, what would it look like? And going off of that, what does sustainability mean to you? So if either of you have an answer ready, you can just jump right in.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in first. So in some ways, this question is quite difficult to answer because I don't think it's necessarily one thing. I think it's really the blending of a lot of different things. But what is top of mind for me when it comes to reimagining your city to be sustainable, I imagine a city in which the inhabitants feel like they belong to it. And this idea of belonging is something that I reference quite a lot in my work, because I think it really points to something a little bit deeper. Like oftentimes we maybe use phrases like diversity and equity, and I think these are really important concepts, and can be helpful ways for us to contextualize the problem. But I think what they're actually trying to get at is the sense of belonging, the sense of feeling like you're safe, that you're part of a community, that you're part of something, a context that is bigger than yourself, right? And so for our cities, what does that mean? It means that we can feel safe in our cities. It means that we have access to the resources that we need. It means that we have housing. It means that we have all of these different components that sort of provide a platform for us to be curious and ask kind of deeper questions about meaning and how we want to kind of chase our purpose. So without those kind of core necessities really there as a bedrock, then it's very difficult for us to actualize ourselves as human beings. So that's where I see something more sustainable in our future. And the other component that I would really bring into that is this kind of integration with nature. So one of the things that really kind of got me interested in sustainability in the first place was studying ecology in my undergrad and kind of doing research on the ecology of urban environments. And I just got really fascinated by this question of how does nature and our urban built environment collaborate? How do they influence each other? How do they interact with each other? And how do we design our built environments in a way that is more conducive to the natural environment? And I don't know if we have really truly integrated that kind of way of thinking. I don't think we have. And so I see that as a kind of core function of what our cities can actually help us do. There's this concept called biomimicry that people may be familiar with, which is the idea of using how nature solves problems and sort of integrating that into our own engineering approaches. So when you're thinking about what an effective built environment looks like, is it actually reproducing some of the natural functions that already exist in the natural space that would be there, for example? So how much carbon is being sequestered in this area? How much water is being absorbed or filtered, etc.? These kind of questions that we're asking, or that we should be asking in terms of how we're building. So that's another key component. I think these two ideas of really introducing ecological principles, and then two, kind of creating our cities and our communities with a sense of belonging for the people who compose them, who comprise them, is what I imagine a sustainable city looking like. And for the second part of the question, as far as what sustainability means to me, really it's about having a sense of identity, a sense of felt an experiential identity of yourself as a part of nature, not as you existing within nature, but as in nature existing within you as well. And that's, you actually can't separate the two. You can't really define something without the context of its environment. And so therefore, they're actually part of the same thing. And that applies to us as well. And so that's how I understand sustainability.
Oh, go ahead, Charlotte.
Oh, sorry. If you want to add in anything before I start, please go ahead.
Oh, no worries. No,
I'm just going to build off of all of the excellent points that Bo brought up. Well, I actually was hoping to kind of flip my response, so I answer your second question first, because I feel like it could potentially be helpful framing. And I also just really want to echo Bo's excellent articulation of the ways that social and ecological justice and sustainability can work in tandem and be really deeply connected. So just for me personally, I am really, really enthusiastic about sustainability and climate justice being very deeply aligned. So there's this definition of climate justice in this resource guide that I just put in the chat and would be happy to share. I have a lot of links I'm hoping to share today. So if anyone wants any of them, please contact me. I'm very happy to share the excellent work, which is very much the basis of how I share all of my interests and my comments. But this is just a handbook that was created by some of the team members of the Climate Hub where I work. And there's this excellent definition in this resource guide of climate justice, which is to say that this concept is sort of how race, gender, class, age, ableism, wealth, power, and other systemically induced vulnerabilities intersect with causes, processes, impacts, and solutions associated with climate change, or as I would frame it, the climate crisis. So quite a long definition with lots of different parts, but I think it is really important to articulate and really deeply analyze all of these different components, which then contribute to the intersecting systems, like Bo mentioned earlier, that really do exacerbate and also facilitate different components of our current climate crisis. So for me, those elements of social and environmental justice and sustainability are really very deeply intertwined, and do also frame how I think about sustainability in my local community, which is so-called Vancouver. And so this is where I was sort of hoping to transition then into how I would reimagine my own city. And this is a little bit more specific to my local context, but I think some of the items are a little bit more broadly applicable. So first of all, we have a lot of activism in Vancouver, which is oriented around food security and housing security, which is very much needed because those are very prominent issues here. But I also just always feel it's important to emphasize that as well as advocating for these causes, it's also really important to understand the underlying systemic inequities which enable all of the suffering which occurs because of these issues. So really recognizing that certain communities face barriers to access safe, secure, healthy housing, a livable income, and access to resources, which would then help them respond to and recover from climate impacts. And one issue that I feel really particularly passionate about is local governments voting into and incorporating in their local policy measures documents and frameworks which have been composed by working groups or local citizens who are directly connected to or experiencing climate impacts. So one other resource that I'm hoping to talk about a little bit more today that's really, really excellent is the City of Vancouver Climate Justice Charter, which was composed by the Climate Equity Working Group in our government. And I'll try and keep this a little bit shorter, but essentially there was a vote on February 15th to essentially sort of guide staff of local government to rely on this climate justice charter in their decision-making and their policy-making approach to climate work. But during that vote on that day, they ended up amending this proposition by striking the section which referred to actually encouraging staff to rely on the report itself, and instead substituted that amendment just by saying that they would incorporate a general equity lens, which if you get a chance to go through this resource, you'll see how much more richness there is actually included in the report. And so the general equity lens is, at least from my perspective, really not intensive enough to understand the very, very complicated issue that is climate injustice. And this is just something that I try and highlight as much as possible. I think it's really important for local governments to incorporate those really important resources, because the stories that we tell about our local communities and about what we can accomplish as a community are really, really vital.
Thank you so much, Charlotte and Bo. It's great to hear both about your visions for cities of the future. And I think it's a really inspiring way to start off this panel. So moving on to the next question, we touched on this a little bit already, but in your opinion, what are the most pressing current issues and barriers within the field of sustainable development?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question, I think, for a number of reasons, but probably mostly because as has been referenced multiple times already, like these issues are all interlinked together. And so kind of picking one out and saying that this one is the most pressing is maybe the wrong approach. Though I do think that where it's useful is recognizing that certain issues affect people differently. And so I think we need to be sensitive to that. So in terms of how to answer this question, I think I would say that the most pressing issue is really a lack of being able to think holistically about the problem. And so this is why I reference being able to sort of have our true identity or our deeper identity as human beings as kind of a core function of how we're thinking about these challenges and how we're thinking about the solutions as well. Are the solutions that we're picking or choosing or going after considering what our full identity as human beings means in terms of that we need access to self-expression, that we need opportunities to be creative, that we need community, that we need safe environments, like all of these different sort of components that we need to thrive as individuals need to be considered in thinking about how we're going to solve these issues. So I would say that's really sort of our biggest problem, maybe a lack of imagination. and a lack of sort of recognizing the interlinked nature of the problem. And kind of going along with that, we have maybe a unique problem in the Western world, if you want to call it that, because we are, one, so individualistic, and two, so mind focused, if you want to call it that. Like we're not quite embodied in the same way as other cultures are, or indeed our indigenous cultures. And so our solutions are also reflecting that. And so I think if we can be a little bit more evocative in the language that we use, we can remind ourselves that we are fully embodied beings on this planet, and that, like I said earlier, nature is not separate from ourselves. So that's where I see kind of the biggest issues, and that's what frustrates me about the level of conversation that we often have in these spaces. It's just a lack of recognition of how the problem is really affecting us on multiple levels, and how our solutions are not actually recognizing or addressing that aspect of the problem as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really incredible, thorough response. I don't love to have to follow it, because you've addressed so many really important key components of, like, lack of imagination is one that also really resonates with me. I think the extent to which we undervalue the role that storytelling and imagination plays in our policymaking, but also just more broadly how we think about the world, it's all really vital. I just, in thinking about this question, I did actually just sort of want to call attention to some of the more problematic elements of even just that term development. And I do have an example of this, which I swear no one from ReImagine 17 asked me or prompted me to kind of plug this. But there is a really excellent report by ReImagine 17 conducting a literature review and report of the UN, or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, that I have had the pleasure of being able to read through and kind of think about a little bit more. So I did just want to kind of share some really cool and interesting points from that in response to this question. So the report itself is fantastic. I would encourage you to go through it and read the reflection prompts and the recommended resources and readings. But there's some really important points in this document about the language of undevelopment or underdevelopment as it's often used, particularly in discussions of political economy and politics more broadly. So the report author, Sarah Law, I believe, makes some really, really important points about how the language of underdevelopment sort of serves as a framework for obfuscating accountability and responsibility for really blatant and overt exploitation, particularly within dynamics of global north to global south countries. And there are some really helpful prompts that can help readers just have a little bit more critical reflexivity and understanding of how current and past, I think the fact that there are both past and current is not emphasized enough, but both acts of colonial violence and land theft or dispossession really, really deeply shape our current contexts and systems of understanding. There's this one quote in the report that I highlighted because I thought it was really, really helpful in thinking about some of these intersecting systems, as Bo has already touched on, but the quote is just, "Language is a social practice that emulates systems of power." And I think this is really important for helping us think about kind of the logic of accumulation and then dispossession, which is really, really imposed by settler colonial states, and also really encourages us to rely on false solutions, green capitalism, and extractive economies, and then lots of other systems that just generally create these very harmful feedback loops. So it's just want to kind of draw attention to some of the potentially very harmful frameworks that we often use around these types of issues. They are obviously very complicated problems, and I think often are just discussions that need to be held in a lot of different types of spaces. So I wanted to share that really excellent resource.
Great, thank you so much for that for both of you. And I think some of the points that we were touching on can lead us into our next question, which is just how can sustainability in cities be made to reduce inequities? And how can it be inclusive and accessible to all people? Again, it's a very broad question, so it might be a bit difficult to bring into just a small point, but if either of you have insights on that, that would be wonderful to hear.
Yeah, Charlotte, do you want to go first? Switch it up?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to go back and forth a little bit. Yeah, so I will shock you. I have another resource that I thought folks might enjoy getting to go through. This is all optional. If you hate reports, then that's what I'm here for, is just to give you some key highlights. But I just always like to add context. So this is a really, I think, helpful report by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, published in 2017, and it's about really like community-led solutions and community-led initiatives and planning, which I think is really helpful. And they have some great just overarching frameworks for thinking about developing equity frameworks, which, like Bo said, is brought up in many different contexts, and sometimes it potentially can be implemented in a less well thought out way. But I think that this is an example of some really helpful, some groups doing some really helpful in-depth work on how we can collectively vision a more equitable and sustainable future more broadly in climate context, but also just as a society. And they have some really incredible points about ensuring that alternatives don't create new or worsen current existing inequalities and inequities. And then also thinking about how we can translate visions which have been developed by community members into specific action items or specific points of reference for policy and decision makers. Another framework that I've found really helpful in thinking about this question, which is currently being developed by the Climate Emergency Working Group at the UBC Now Sustainability Hub, which I can share the link to as well in just a second, is the monitoring. I know it's being used in other places, but I just know from UBC context, there are specific projects oriented around this as well. The monitoring, evaluation, and learning methodologies are, I think, really, really helpful for thinking about this. So I can try and find some specific resources, but it's kind of a more comprehensive, more in-depth rubric and set of criteria that can be used for evaluating justice principles and a justice lens specifically for the types of organizational priorities that are being implemented, helps to identify gaps and just reflect on not just sort of the outcomes of a specific initiative or project, but actually how these issues or new concepts are being perceived and received by community members as well. So I'll include that link too, but I'll pass things back over to Bo.
Awesome. Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, so I guess it's kind of a running theme that it takes a lot of sort of different approaches, and I think that's the point. And being intentional about accepting that, I think, is really critical to this whole conversation. One of the things that I think is really important is to take our cues from how nature works. And so when I think about something like communities, which is or ecosystems, which maybe is the natural equivalent of what cities are like, it's the diversity that makes them strong. It's the fact that different organisms or different categories of organisms are fulfilling different functions or roles within the broader ecosystem. And so our cities really can kind of benefit from that similar sort of approach, meaning that we want our communities to actually be diverse. We want them to reflect a broad range of lived experiences, access to resources, etc., all of these different kind of things, so that our cities do not become siloed in the same way that many aspects of our society are as well. And I think through kind of that approach, one, you get a more organic and natural feeling city. I think there's a reason why older cities, especially older European cities, seem so appealing to people. Like people like to be able to go to, you know, downtown Prague or something like that, or Budapest, and walk around. And there's a reason, like those cities are old and they're organic. They weren't overly planned. They kind of just grew with the population. And so because of that, they're walkable, and they have a lot of different types of amenities and services available to people in different places. I've had the privilege of living in multiple different cities, including Budapest, actually. So just from my own personal experience, it's something that I'm quite aware of, and something that North American cities often lack, especially with our over dependence on cars, really kind of making it difficult to get around. So I would say this is one thing that can really go a long way to kind of reducing some of those inequities. You know, if no matter where you are in the city, you've got a park not too far from you, you've got a good school fairly close to you, you've got grocery stores and other sort of amenities within an approachable distance. You know, that becomes that provides, I should say, a more natural way for people to live their lives, so that they're not having to do this crazy crisscross sort of travel system just to kind of get around. And especially if you have kids on top of that and they've got activities, like it just becomes really difficult for people. So that's one kind of it's not necessarily a solution, but it is a way of thinking. It is a way of orienting how we want to grow, or how we want our city to feel, so the people who are living in it. And that's kind of my underlying approach to things, is like, how is this going to affect the way that people feel? And I think if we can kind of focus on that as a way to orient the way that we make decisions, then you know, that's definitely I think a more effective way forward.
Thank you for that. And Bo, I know you mentioned at the beginning taking cues from nature to plan our cities. And I know a lot of that is commonly rooted in Indigenous practices. So I did want to ask, what is the importance in planning for cities with the involvement of Indigenous leaders and Indigenous knowledge? And Charlotte, I know that your work at the UBC Climate Hub, you work a lot placing focus on Indigenous climate justice advocates. So if you wanted to start us off, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah, I did, just in reflecting on this question, I don't necessarily think that personally I'm the best person to outline for folks directly. Like I can't speak directly for Indigenous communities working on climate justice or activism, but I do have some resources directly from groups that have spoken on this subject that I did just want to share. So there's this really excellent, very, very short, it's an Instagram carousel, so you can read it in literally 5 minutes. If you ignore everything else that I've put here today, which is totally understandable, I would definitely encourage you to read this one, Indigenous Climate Action Guide to Divestment. It's a really important and easy to read resource. So I did just want to bring that into our conversation, and also add in some of the concepts that this very short guide touches on, are issues such as how settler colonialism and colonial concepts more broadly really encourage ongoing acts of violence and dispossession, which have functioned to displace Indigenous communities. So specifically, this isn't mentioned in the guide, but just in thinking about terms like, if anyone's ever heard the Latin term terra nullius, which is sort of functions in a lot of ways to displace the idea that Indigenous individuals and communities have existed on, specifically in a Canadian context, on these lands since time immemorial, and have been stewarding these lands, and have so much experience working with nature in the context that have been brought up today. So just thinking about how Indigenous communities have been displaced by acts of colonial violence and are still, in a very contemporary and current way, being impacted and dispossessed by the fossil fuel industry. It is really important, I would argue, and I believe lots of climate activists would argue, to listen to and collaborate alongside communities who have directly been impacted by a lot of the issues that we are talking about today that impact climate crisis issues. So that's sort of what I was thinking about a little bit in the context of the why or the what of why Indigenous sovereignty is really, really vital in city planning. But that really, to me, just feels like only barely scratching the surface of this really vital issue. So I did also just want to share some really excellent resources by the Indigenous Environmental Network, where they've published reports on issues such as greenwashing tools and ways. They've outlined some really, really helpful, important ways to support and advocate for Indigenous sovereignty in a climate context. So if you want to get a little bit deeper into the issue and get into more of the how, this is a really excellent resource pool to look at for that.
Great, thank you so much, Charlotte. And before, Bo, you give your insights on this question, I just wanted to say a big welcome to Annabelle for joining us and just give you a space to introduce yourself before we move on.
Hello, I just want to start off with my sincere apologies. I'm currently in a dorm at the moment, and there was just a Wi-Fi kind of like shutdown. So I was unable to join. I joined earlier this morning when Alicia was still presenting. So that was really great that I was able to join for the beginning moment. And I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to join until now.
Yeah, no worries, Annabelle. If you'd just like to give a short introduction, who you are, your pronouns, where you're calling in from, and just a little bit of background, and then we can just jump right back into the panel.
Sure, of course. I'm Annabelle. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently calling from Singapore, and Malay Singaporeans are recognized by the government as the Indigenous people of the country. So I would just like to take a second to acknowledge that. I'm currently on an exchange semester at the National University here, but I'm in my final year of my undergraduate degree at UBC. And I'm in the Global Resource Systems program, focusing on sustainability and communications. So it's a very interdisciplinary science-based program that really has a lot of flexibility in what you focus your studies on. And my background primarily focuses on launching capacity building programs at UBC's Sustainability Office, or managing the UBC Student Union's sustainable projects and facilities, and then also doing communications and outreach for various nonprofits like Social Innovation Canada. So thank you again for giving me the space to introduce myself.
Great, thank you so much. So we are currently on the question of what is the importance in planning for cities with the involvement of Indigenous leaders and Indigenous knowledge. So Charlotte just gave a really great response, and now I'm going to invite Bo to give a response, and you can chime in right after, Annabelle.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question, and I think one of the words I used earlier was belonging, and in some ways, the way that I think about that concept has been really influenced by conversations that I've had and things that I've read from Indigenous leaders and from Indigenous communities, and also from my own cultural heritage and background, which is West African and from Nigeria more specifically, as that's a big part of our cultural context, as well as a sense of belonging and a sense of belonging not only to each other but also to nature as well. And I think it's something that we have to be careful of when we're thinking about how to involve Indigenous leaders and communities as well, is to not come with that same orientation of extraction that has often happened in the past, where they have something that we want, which is knowledge. And so we're going to go and get knowledge from them, and then what? It's like, so I'm cautious of that sort of approach, but this idea of belonging, of we are part of you, you are part of us. How can we do this better? How can we learn from this long history that this community has with the land? And so how do we bring a sense of openness and of eagerness in terms of wanting to learn from them rather than extract from them? I think is really important. I'm very fortunate to sit on the board of an organization called Makeway, the Makeway Foundation. And we recently had, in June, our in-person board meeting, which was actually out in BC as well. And we went to Lytton, the area that was devastated by forest fires a few years ago. And we met with the indigenous community there, and just kind of getting a sense of how are they managing it, how can we support them better, and how can we help them rebuild their community. And the thing that I was kind of really struck with was one, their absolute fierce optimism that was infectious, and then two, their kind of truly intergenerational collaborative approach to dealing with issues, to creating space for people to talk about their own personal experience through this thing that they've gone through, and how we can we can turn this into an opportunity to do things better, to do things differently, to learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past. And so I think for us, it's simultaneously about unlearning and unknowing, which is, I think reference to some of our inherited colonial attitudes and assumptions, and then learning or relearning or acquiring or integrating this kind of more holistic sense of knowledge that our Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities have. And it's really about partnership, I think, in the true sense of the word, not just a mouthed kind of partnership, but a truly a deep one that recognizes sovereignty and sort of these different components that I think as a country and as a world we're struggling to work through together.
Great, thank you so much, Bo, and Annabelle, feel free to jump in with your own thoughts.
Right, thank you so much. I think that we always talk about cities or urban planning with these super modern or even futuristic notions, which means that in the same breath, when we talk about including Indigenous communities in plans and initiatives and programs and the future, this means embedding Indigenous ways of knowing in our cities. And I think that when we speak about Indigenous culture and practices, a lot of times people speak in the context of the past in terms of, preserving the past, which is super important, but it's really equally important to not forget that every culture continues to grow towards the future. And there is a ton of great literature that I've been honored to read about Indigenous futurism, Afrofuturism, Adivasi futurism, and this is all encapsulating how Indigenous culture intersects with things like technology and imagines what Indigenous futures could look like. And I think that especially keeping in mind that right now, 80% of the remaining biodiversity on this planet is located on Indigenous people's land, we should really be prioritizing their ways of knowing when we're talking about creating sustainable cities, which isn't happening enough. And so I think that through all of these pathways towards sustainable cities, we can work to decolonize our worldviews and our different organizational systems by acknowledging the major current gaps that exist in things like healthcare and equity, in education between non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, continuing to grow partnerships, genuine partnerships with Indigenous groups, and advocating for the rights and titles and lands and self-determination of Indigenous people. These are all things that, should be considered and talked about when we talk about modern cities, urban planning, sustainable cities, etc.
Those are some really good points, Annabelle. Thank you so much for that. And since we only have 6 minutes left, I'm just going to wrap up here with one final question for all of you, which I'm hoping can be a way to end this panel off with something tangible that the audience can kind of take home with themselves. So what is one actionable thing that people can do to contribute to sustainability in their own cities? I don't know if anyone has an answer right away, but if not, Annabelle, did you want to start us off?
Sure, I would love to. I think that for my own personal experiences, I found that education and raising awareness is truly, truly the first most important step in, I guess, taking action. And raising awareness obviously is also a way to take action. But for me personally, I was introduced to, environmentalism and conservation when I first led youth camps at the Vancouver Aquarium that focused on like marine life and sustainability. And myself and so many of the people that I worked alongside for those years went on to pursue careers and post-secondary education that was related to climate action. So obviously a step had to be made there where we took what we were inspired by, or we took what we were learned, and then we took action next. But I think that advocating for an environmental curriculum in our education is really, really empowering for so many people. And it's also proven that youth or children who are close to nature or interact with nature more are more likely to feel a deeper connection to nature as they grow older and care for the planet. Another thing that I can, I guess, think of that is more specific to contributing to sustainability in cities that might not be as exciting, but is very realistic is, especially within this current profit-driven society, is really just speaking with your dollars and prioritizing businesses that are energy efficient and sustainable, prioritizing businesses that are BIPOC owned, or supporting ventures that supporting ventures by marginalized groups and not consuming more than we need are all very real ways to embed sustainability into our own lives and into the culture of our cities. So yeah, these are a few things that I can think of, and obviously they're not perfect solutions, but it's really difficult to spend time looking for the quote unquote perfect solution in a system that's already super flawed. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in next. The first thing I'll say is that I think it's really important for you to have some kind of practice of joy or pleasure, or however you want to call it, because that is a fundamental component of the human experience. And I think it's something that can give you motivation and enthusiasm for the things that are a little bit more challenging in your life too. So that needs to be a priority, I think, for everybody. Just finding things that they can do to give them those kind of feelings of lightness and things like that. The two suggestions that I have, one is, find the natural spaces in your city and use them, whether it's parks or whatever. But I think, the more that our cities can see that providing access to nature is something that benefits the people who live there, then, it may become more of a priority for them. So that would be one. And then two would be, whatever you feel is on your heart, whether it's something that you're passionate about or something that you care about, it doesn't even have to be an issue. It can be a hobby or something like that you place a lot of time into. It's going to have some kind of component of ecology or sustainability to it. And so if you can look at it through that framework or through that lens, then that's an easy avenue for you to get involved in an issue that is related to sustainability through something that you already know about or care about. For myself, it's music. That's one of my biggest passions. And so I think about how can I participate in this economy of music in a way that is more sustainable, whether it's, the way that I'm purchasing tickets, or how I'm traveling to get to these events, or just that kind of orientation makes you ask different questions. And I think there's a quote by Rumi, which is "Speak a new language, and then the world will be a new world." And so I think the kind of language that we use and the kind of questions that we ask really shapes the way that we show up. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Those are both incredible responses. So I'm happy to get to throw in mine as well. I'll again draw on the Climate Doom to Messy Hope handbook by the UBC Climate Hub and created by Megan Wise, our coordinator. If you go to page 28 specifically of this report, there's a really, really excellent comprehensive list of different just ways of approaching systems change at a systems level, both as an individual, as part of your community, and then more broadly within the systems of which you're a part. Obviously, these three different kind of levels are very interconnected. If you can participate in, pardon me, sorry, I'm getting very dry throat. I think all three are really wonderful ways to engage your community.
Great. Thank you so much, Bo, Charlotte, and Annabelle for being here today and just adding so much insight to this panel. It was amazing to hear all of your thoughts, ideas, and resources. So this concludes the end of our final event, as well as the end of the 2023 Reimagining the Future conference. I would just like to say a big thank you to everyone here, to the workshop facilitators, speakers, feedback advisors, youth mobilizers, and just everyone else who helped to make this conference happen. And thank you to our attendees for your participation and all of your support this weekend. We at ReImagine 17 hope that this conference has sparked motivation for you to create actionable change and just to shift the status quo in your own communities. And that's where we will leave you. If you would like to stay and connect with others, we will be having a network session now in another Zoom call. So if you have the link and would like to join for that, go right ahead. But other than that, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.